is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. We'll be talking about engaging with healthcare organizations and specifically in pediatric space. And again, CHOC is an amazing institution, extremely innovative and eager to engage with innovators. We'll hear today from Nadine and Phuong from CHOC about how to engage with CHOC, what is happening at CHOC, what are the steps to working together. And then you will hear from a very interesting startup that is currently engaged with CHOC. And you will hear from innovators how the process actually worked for them when they engaged. So just to set the stage, Nadine, before we switch to you, sort of pediatrics and commercialization landscape. Babies look very cute and we all love them. Unfortunately, when investors look at a baby picture on an investor deck, immediately questions come up about the market size. Right? And that has been a problem in pediatrics because investor perspective has not changed. What we're seeing is we do see clients coming to us at SBDC. And when we ask, have you considered pediatrics? Because we're looking at their device or product, they say, well, we did, but our advisors told us not to do it. And it sort of breaks my heart, and it really is unfortunate. But there are changes currently in that landscape. Those changes started a while ago. For example, in 2009, the Consortium for Pediatric Devices was formed, and there's a lot of good things coming out of it, a lot of support. Again, we have clients who apply to CTIP program, for example, and they're getting good results. But there are also multi-site collaborations now in Orange County, and again, CHOC is right in the middle of it. And I would like to turn it over to Nadine to set that stage a little bit more, talk about the unique advantages in working with pediatric institutions before we jump into the steps of how actually to engage with CHOC.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Laura. You know, as you mentioned, working in the peds space, it's tough because the ROI is not great. And in order to keep moving your device forward, your research forward, your innovation forward, you need funding to be able to do that. And so, you know, you can turn to folks, SBIR, federal funding as well, but there might be a time where you need to kind of look into angels and that philanthropic piece. I think a lot of folks forget that like peds is 0 to when the patient hits their 22nd birthday. And so there's, you know, a really nice market as well. It's not just little tiny cute babies, which we love, but that 18, 19, 20 that can translate really nicely kind of back and forth into the adult market. You don't do these things without partnerships and without leveraging those partnerships in order to get to your next milestone. And as we talk about sort of this multi-site collaboration, I'm thrilled to partner with the folks at, you know, Laura and Julie over at SBDC, because they can help identify those federal funding strategies, the SBIR, building that advisory board. How do you know, get those funds and, you know, find the right grant writer and then be able to deliver all that. So it really, I think Orange County is placed perfectly with our colleagues at UCI in the engineering school, the medical school, and UCI's Beall Applied Innovation, who has entrepreneurs in residence. They have a variety of resources as well that entrepreneurs can leverage. I have my colleague here. Nothing happens without her at CHOC. She is our like air traffic controller who says, how fast can we go? Where are we going? What lane do we need to be in? Because you really need that infrastructure to accelerate your device to get to the next milestone. At the end of the day, we want the best technology to hit the patient. And you know, we think about our clinical work and our engineering work, but you know, we serve the patients at the end of the day. So if you can streamline the operations, you can streamline the tech, you can leverage the tech at the places it needs to be leveraged. You can engage with data science. You can, you know, capture those clinical insights that make the device meaningful and impactful. And I know that's really important to Dr. Sanger, who those of you have met as well, is get the best clinical expertise and technology to the patient, even more now, right, that we saw during COVID, the advancements in remote telehealth and monitoring and all those kinds of devices, but aggregating that can be challenging, and getting that operational piece and workflow down for your team to be able to do that, both in the entrepreneurial team and internally at CHOC. We are so lucky at CHOC to have all of those pieces and to have a great infrastructure. My colleague Phuong, she is our Director of Research Operations, and she's been at CHOC now, I think, almost 10 years. I'd love her to share a little bit what makes CHOC unique as Orange County's pediatric hospital, and I'll mute in between some of the questions, Phuong.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Hello, everyone. My name, as Nadine shares, Phuong, I'm the Director of Research Operations. Before my role at CHOC, I was a research administrator at UC Irvine, so I'm familiar with the UC system. And also prior to my current role at CHOC, I was also the Chief Compliance Officer for a cancer adult hospital in the Seattle area within the UW health system, so University of Washington, another academic research entity. Excuse me. This is my actually second time at CHOC. When I heard that CHOC and UCI has entered into a formal affiliation, it was a very exciting time for me, and I contacted my colleagues at CHOC and asked to come back. And I had an opportunity to help develop that first pediatric clinical research strategic plan that is a joint plan for CHOC and UCI, and that's very exciting. So in my current role, I help make things go at CHOC when it comes to clinical research. That's the operations piece. What makes CHOC a wonderful collaborator? Many things. We know children and we know children's families really well. And we, by being in Orange County, we have access to very diverse patient population. Depending on what you're working with, if you're looking for trial participants or data from diverse patient groups, CHOC has it. We, in addition to the patients, we engage the whole family. So we have patient advisory councils, both English speaking and Spanish speaking, and we get their feedback. That's how CHOC is clinically excellent, because we take the feedback from our community and we integrate that and improve the care and the services we offer. So we use that kind of information to also leverage how we engage in clinical research with these patients and families. That's how our IRB is informed about what a model consent should look like. That's how IRB is informed about what an assent should contain. So the work that we do is very integrative and involve the whole family. We know pediatric medicine really well. If you look across Orange County, even all of Southern California, CHOC has hundreds of pediatric subspecialists. Not only are they pediatricians, they specialize in a tiny area of their field. I'll take oncology, for example. You have pediatric oncologists who then specializes in a set of really rare tumors. So it's we have a wide range of these subspecialists at CHOC, and that is also a great opportunity for us to work with companies like yours. And then lastly, we know pediatric clinical research. At any given time, our research enterprise at CHOC run upwards of 500 plus active pediatric clinical trials. We do these studies, and we do, before we implement them, we engage in feasibility with each one of these, and through experience, we know what doesn't work. We know what looks great on paper when you're writing the protocol, and we know where the problems will be in terms of execution, specifically with our patient population. So the last thing I'll comment there is that unlike other places where clinical research resources might be dispersed across the institution, at CHOC, they're all centralized under the Research Institute. All the services, all the clinical research personnel, that's all your data support assistants, your research coordinators, your clinical research managers, biostatistician, scientific writer, they're all under our umbrella. And so the facilitation and the access is much easier when we have that kind of centralization. So Nadine, do you want me at this point to speak more about how to engage with CHOC, or you want to save that for a little bit later?
No, I'd love you to, and also share, what would you like these pediatric innovators and entrepreneurs to know in order for us to help them and for us to help get them to their next milestone?
Sure. So if that's the case, it may be helpful to discuss the menu of services, if you will, that we have available for our industry partners. I'll start with the regulatory framework. Regulatory and business consulting. We can provide this service to you. If you haven't done a trial in pediatrics, if you haven't done a trial that involves a clinical trial period, we can help, either you come with a draft or we can help you draft a protocol that is implementable within the pediatric setting. We have staff within our research institute that can engage depending on where you're at. Sometimes I get a draft protocol from a device company. They say, will this be implementable at your institution? And we read through that with the right teams and we mark that up and we give it back to you. Some people come and they just have a high level summary of what it is they like to do. And then from there, we help them flesh that out. So it's both clinical trial design, protocol development, but more importantly, that regulatory and feasibility piece is really important. If you've not worked with HIPAA before, if you've not worked with the common rule, if you're submitting data to the FDA but have not worked with the FDA, this area is an area that we can help you with. So that's first set. The others, if you have a need to access data, so you're not doing a clinical trial, but you're looking at utilizing an EMR sandbox to test your product, your service, whatever it might be, we can work with you to potentially create a test data set that might work for you. So that's another that we can offer. If you are doing clinical trials and you're looking beyond just CHOC, you're looking at a multi-center trial design. How do you create not only the protocol, but how do you pull in other centers? We can assist with that. CHOC belongs to a number of consortiums and pediatric organizations that we can connect you with other potential pediatric sites across the country. So that's another example of what we can do. And then finally, the parent and patient focus groups, we can facilitate that. Sometimes some of our partners just need access to a certain subset of our patients and families to get some feedback. There are a number of other services that's in development now, and I can speak with you in greater detail when we have them line up. And if you have a specific area that you like to engage, feel free to reach out and connect with me, and I can provide you with much more specific input. But stepping back from an administrator's perspective, there are some observations, some learned experiences I like to share with you. When you engage with an entity like CHOC, be very firm and committed to your objectives, the what that you want to accomplish. But do be very flexible about the how. There might be cultural differences between, a hospital entity versus a private company. So you might have an idea of how to do something, but when you engage with us, we may advise, well, because of HIPAA, we have to do it this way. Because of how we see patients in our hospital and clinic, we might have to do it this way. So do be flexible on the strategy and the implementation approach. This is where we can give some input. And if you are flexible, I believe that the outcome will be optimal if we can work together. We won't have to compromise on the objective of what you want to accomplish, but we do need some flexibility to advise and inform how best to move through our organization and to implement what it is that you want to implement.
I was thinking,
yes.
before you switch to the next step, which is exactly the steps to engage, maybe either you or Nadine want to talk a little bit about just on the high level, the advantage of going into pediatrics. in general, again, to sort of counter that perception that you should stay away from pediatrics. So the a la carte services that you offer, to me, it already communicates a lot of value, because in adult settings, sometimes that's not what you can get. But also maybe talk about, again, the FDA SHIP initiative, the extra grants that you can access. And one of the issues is just purely cultural. You know, having been in pediatrics, I know how just the culture is different. It's easier to work with pediatricians. It's easier to work with pediatric hospitals. So maybe you know, either you or Nadine kind of address that aspect to sort of start changing that perspective that some people have, where they're just cautious and they think it's not worth it to go into pediatrics.
Well, thank you for that soft question, Laura. We're kind of biased, right? We believe that pediatric is a great place to start for lots of reasons. I'll turn it over to Nadine later to talk about FDA. That's her baby. Why pediatric? Well, first of all, there's a lot of opportunities in pediatric. We believe at CHOC that there is a reverse approach. You can do pediatric first. You start with the pediatric and then you move toward the adult, if the adult is even relevant. But a lot of the time, it doesn't make sense to start in adult and move down to pediatric, because some of the conditions we're talking about only applies in pediatric. If you're looking at, for example, lifespan issues in healthcare, it makes sense to start in pediatric. And I think hospitals like CHOC has made it really easy to engage, has carved out this as our niche, and accessibility is what we work day in and day out to improve. And that accessibility is for our industry partners. I'm not sure if there is that same level of effort and intention with adult institutions to ensure this ease of access. Well, what's in it for CHOC, you might ask? We're just tired of our patient population being treated as many adults. If you have talked to a clinician, the pediatric world is very challenging. We take devices that's been approved for adult and we tinker with it. We try to figure out what's the best way to use it on kids. We do the same with drugs. And it's just, in many cases, it just doesn't work. So we are incentivized to make it easier for industry to do research in pediatrics, so that in the long term, we're able to put it to use to create that direct impact and translation as quickly as we can without that guesswork in between. So Nadine, do you want to comment on FDA SHIP?
Sure. And I put a link in the chat for everyone. So about 10 years ago, the FDA launched the Pediatric Device Consortium. And so they gave federal funding to various sites across the US in order to accelerate PEDS medtech, because they found it is an underserved population, and there's not a lot of funding generated in there. Even when we talk to some of our UCI faculty and colleagues, they say, well, there's not enough funding and NSF grants and federal grants in there. And so the FDA PDC program was to encourage folks to work in PEDS, because, surprise, kids grow up to be adults. So the healthier that you have children, the healthier your economies are. I think it's a great place to innovate, and I'm a big fan of longevity studies and all that as well. Recently, 2018, the FDA brought together a large group of industry leaders, regulatory folks, reimbursement folks, biotech, medtech folks, clinician leaders, engineers, entrepreneurs, to help develop the FDA SHIP program, and that's the Systems for Hospital Innovation in Pediatrics. And that is to include the hospital early on in the process. Our CHOC leaders, Dr. Anthony Chang and Dr. Terry Sanger, both serve on their committee as well and work closely with the SHIP team. There's some just phenomenal people in that group. But getting the hospitals early on helps to get user feedback, get clinical insights, clinical expertise, engineering insights as well, and really figure out the data management piece. Interoperability at hospitals, is really challenging. We can have a 2021 device, and the hospital was built in 1982. And so things like that can be really challenging. So getting the hospital engaged early on. I'm excited to be working with Phuong and Dr. Sanger in order to make sure that CHOC lines up with industry in some aspects and with these FDA regulatory programs in order to accelerate, because you get to a certain place and you need regulatory approval, and our entrepreneurs and our innovators are like, you know, we've just paid for our regulatory consulting, we now have approval, but now we need to sort of work with the hospitals, and we need to get in there to collect the data in order to publish, because that's our currency. So I think this kind of roadmap and having the FDA be in the SHIP program come early on into this innovation process, I think will be really helpful. It's meaningful, and this is where we can fill in the gaps as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nadine. And again, hopefully we convinced most of you, some of you, that you should look into pediatrics. And again, like Phuong said, it could be the entry point, and then you expand into the adult world. And again, investors are looking, yes, on one hand, they're telling you stay away from pediatrics, it's a small market. On the other hand, they're always telling you, have you gotten any traction? Did you get any clinical feedback? Well, getting into an adult hospital sometimes is very difficult. So if pediatrics are so welcoming and so eager to work with you, why wouldn't you start there to get that traction, to get that clinical feedback? You know, go after that market. You know, use all the resources that are available. Again, regulatory, clinical trials. After that, you can expand, and investors will actually have more confidence that you will bring your product to market, and then expand into that adult population.
One other thing, Laura, I just want to add is sort of like the ethics in peds, right? Is that you're testing on children, which can be really challenging. I think Dr. Sanger talks about this at all. Like, why is it different from adults to kids? It's a human life, and testing on children is just as risky. So I think the culture and how we communicate about innovating in pediatrics with really vulnerable populations is important as well, because ethically, it is just as risky to do clinical trials and device trials in children and adults. But if a child, and it's your child especially, parents will do whatever it takes, whenever it takes, in order to make their child better and to increase their health and wellness.
Well, I like to argue that it's unethical not to include research data or research in the testing and then market the product and expect off-label use in the pediatric space without that safety data. So I think we can make the argument either way, but from a pediatric hospital's perspective, we like to see research data being part of any testing versus the opposite, the adult data, then expect pediatric use to be extrapolated from that.
Right. Right. So maybe now we can switch gears and talk about how to engage. So what are the steps? Because I think that's where it's sort of paralysis by analysis. People don't know, and they don't know whom to call, and they connect with a clinician, and then sometimes clinician doesn't quite know where to tell them to go, and all things just come to a grinding halt.
Start with us. So Nadine and I are your contacts. Laura, you brought up a really good point. There can be a lot of dead time when you go down the wrong path within an organization, and things can happen simultaneously. But if you start with us, we can get a number of things going, or you might not know who the best clinician might be for your project. You just might know one clinician at CHOC. We have access to hundreds of clinicians, and we know who may have the clinical expertise that's best suited for your project. Maybe it's more than one individual, and we can make that match. Mm-hmm. It's so important to start at the right place, because it will ensure that we put you down the right workflow. We have multiple workflows. This is common, whether it's UCI or CHOC or any other institution at that, right? We develop these workflows, whether it's industry initiated and industry funded, CHOC investigated, initiated, industry funded, or it's a partnership or whatever it is. We have these templates, right? Whether it's contracting, budget, et cetera. And if you work with one of us, we can identify that right template and put it down the right path. If a template doesn't exist, folks like Nadine and I can create that template for you. But if you start with a clinician, they'll tell you what they know exists, but they are not going to be able to tell you what can be built. And sometimes in working with industry, we're building new things all the time, because there hasn't been a model for that type of collaboration or project currently. But we're very committed, so we'll work with you to build it. But you have to start with the right people.
Right. So Phuong, maybe because we're trying to also tell people how to work in general with either other pediatric institutions or even other adult organizations. What would be a title? Because it varies from place to place, but in general, what would be the titles that people should look for? Because I know in this case they just know, okay.
So in addition to the clinician contact that you might have, start with a research administrator, or if you're working with an academic entity, identify the department administrator that clinician routes all of his or her industry partnerships and sponsor projects through. That's the person you want to connect with in conjunction with the clinician you're working with, to ensure that in parallel you're getting the clinical input that you need, but also the work that is being discussed is being scoped out, and a lane is being identified for how that scope of work, that engagement, is going to be processed by the institution. So look for people with titles like department administrator, research administrator. At CHOC, it goes through the sponsor projects office, and we have pre and post award. So when you're at the planning stage, you're likely working with pre-award people and not post-award people. They're managing the finances on the back end. But the tricky part here, Laura, is that every institution is organized a little bit differently and job titles vary. The idea here is that you just need to connect, in addition with the clinician and administrator who handles the business processes for the organization. That includes budgeting, contracting, if there are any other regulatory reviews, et cetera, that's needed. That is your go-to person to clear the institutional business processes. The clinician you connect with, if he's or she is experienced in doing this, will quickly connect you with his or her administrator. And if they don't, ask for that.
Now, I know we'll be talking about research and running, trials, but for those entrepreneurs who are looking to validate their ideas, what would you advise? They're at the point where they just actually need to validate the need to make sure that what they're developing or planning to develop is actually needed and will be accepted.
Yeah, so we certainly provide support there too, and it could be informal or formal, depending on what we're looking for, right? In a formal engagement, we have put together at CHOC consulting services, and we have conversations with companies about what it is that they're seeking. And sometimes it's just X number of hours for one of our clinicians to validate their idea, to review and give feedback, to comment, to say, to discuss what the current treatment or how patients are being processed right now. So that could be a formal engagement. The informal is that you set up an opportunity to just have a very early conversation with someone at our institution, and we can arrange for that. You reach out to an administrator like myself, or if you have direct contact, to say, this is very informal, I just need 30 minutes of your time or an hour of your time to run an idea by you. And that is, the depth isn't there, Laura, but we don't need any formality for things that are at that level. If you need to go much deeper and you need to write up a report, to give feedback in writing, et cetera, the latter, the more formal engagement is advised.
So Phuong, I know at some point we'll want to invite the star of the show, the startup, to talk about their process. But I wanted to make sure that you covered everything that you want to cover as far as the steps of engagement with CHOC.
Yeah, I would want to say one last thing. I know that when we work with some of our industry partners, there is usually a time crunch, and people that we've engaged with want to get in there very quickly, whatever that in is. Start the trial, start the data review, start the product assessment. I, from experience, have found that the time spent on the planning pays off in dividends. So 90% planning, 10% execution is always my approach. And it's in the long run, it's going to save you money and it's going to save you time. It might sound counterintuitive to spend 90% of your time on planning, but it's really true. A lot of the work that I engage in that didn't spend enough time in the planning, you have to go back and retool things or collect an additional data point or redesigned something related to the way that you had envisioned. And a lot of times, all of these rework, if you will, could have been avoided if we spent a little bit more time in the planning phase. So if nothing else, I want to leave with that, which is work with us and allow us to spend a lot of time with you in the planning phase. And if we do that well, the execution will be much smoother. It'll save money in the long run, and you get your data and your results much faster.
Someone is asking ballpark planning time to enable.
It depends on it depends on the scale of the project. So the planning is not just about IRB submission, right? I see that in the comment. So the question itself is, what is the ballpark planning time to enable an IRB submission? It depends on how complex your study is. If it's a simple data collection study with no intervention, it doesn't take very long. If it's an involved study that involves multiple arms, there's an intervention crossover, the study design is complex, and the risk. Remember, the other thing is about the risk, right? We have to address the risk somehow in the protocol. So if your study introduces more than standard acceptable risk, we have to take a closer look at that. So it's hard for me to answer that question, but usually the getting IRB approval is almost, how do I say this? Don't engage the IRB until you're ready, because it's like the IRS, right? You send something in and it becomes very bureaucratic from there on. The IRB sends you a memo, you have to address everything, it has to go back to the next meeting, et cetera. And so you are now asking for a very protracted timeline. So I always ask teams to hold off on IRB submission. And the idea is that you get a clean submission, meaning one time to an IRB committee, you get a letter that is straight up approval or approval with some administrative conditions that we can resolve. And that is how, an example of 90% planning and 10% execution. So I won't be able to answer that question directly because it's so study dependent, but do work with whatever institution you work with to plan a really smooth and clean IRB submission. That's the best route to go.
Mm-hmm. And Phuong, last question before while Dr. Kuperman is loading her slides to share. Someone is asking, and I just want to confirm that everything is going through you. They want to know if there's a formal connection between UCI and CHOC, but as far as the coordination of clinical trials, you are the person who is coordinating it, correct?
Yeah, so UCI actually has a separate Center for Clinical Research. I don't know if that's what David is referring to. There are some studies where we jointly do it together with UCI, and there are some studies that are only done at UCI or done at CHOC. So it depends on what the study needs are. We can roll it out across both CHOC and UCI or just one of those institutions. We are different shops, but we're coordinated. And the IRB between CHOC and UCI has a reliance mechanism in place, and we work together for many years. So it's single IRB review. One of our institutions will be the reviewing IRB, and the other will be the relying IRB. You won't need to go through two IRB reviews for studies done at CHOC and UCI.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay, so at this point, let's turn it over to Rachel, Dr. Cooperman, and hear about their entrepreneurial journey and how they worked with CHOC. We're very eager. I think everyone is very eager to hear about their device and their journey.
Thank you so much. It's been very interesting, even though I've gone through the process with CHOC. So my name's Rachel. My training is in pediatric epilepsy. My background is I was a physicist as an undergraduate, and then fell in love with neurology and ultimately epilepsy, and was really excited to take my technical skills that I learned as an undergraduate with neurophysiology into the clinical space. So as many of you know, epilepsy is defined as a disorder of recurrent seizures. Most people think the seizures are convulsive, but actually the bulk of seizures are non-convulsive, can be quite subtle. And the ultimate goal of treatment is to stop seizures while minimizing side effects. So in the United States, epilepsy is a big problem. And there's roughly 3.5 million people diagnosed with epilepsy in the US, which translates to 1 in 26 people, which is interesting. As a practicing clinician, I would always say to my patients, you know, if there was a new diagnosis, is there anybody in the family who has epilepsy? And say, no, I've never, nobody has epilepsy. And then at the follow-up visit, they'd go, oh, you know, we talked to our family and it turns out that so-and-so has epilepsy and so-and-so has epilepsy. And there's so much stigma around the diagnosis that people don't talk about it. And in reality, epilepsy is more common than autism, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis combined. So this is a highly prevalent disease. And it comes with big costs. So financial costs, $28 billion spent on direct medical expenditures in the US alone, comes with an increased risk of death, 2 to 3 times the risk of premature death. And the part that really affected me as a clinician, and ultimately my patients, is that there's been no significant improvement in clinical outcomes in 2 to 3 decades. As a practicing clinician, I think I understood why that was. So while I was able to care for patients in the hospital with these powerful tools that involve doing, you know, putting electrodes directly on the brain and understanding where seizures were coming from, when patients were at home, it was a black box. I didn't know what was going on in any way, and nor did the families. And as a clinician, I was putting an unfair burden on them to try to explain to me what was happening with their seizure control and their side effects, when we know patients can't count seizures accurately. And it's very hard for a 5-year-old to tell you specifically that they're having dizziness associated with their anticonvulsant, right? So as a clinician, I felt like I was putting an undue burden on my patients and not providing them the best care, because I couldn't track how they were progressing from a clinical standpoint with the treatments I was making. And working in a children's hospital, I had an endocrinologist who down the hall, and the endocrinologist knew what was going on with their patients, right? Their patients would come in and they would download data about glucose, and they would understand how somebody's doing. And it would be the equivalent of an endocrinologist managing someone with diabetes. Instead of saying, hey, I don't want to see your glucose data, let's just talk about how the insulin affects you. Yes, it's important to understand how it's affecting you, but you also need some data in order to adjust that insulin, and not just discuss how the intervention is making you feel. So a cardiologist, similar thing. Other direction down the hall was a cardiologist, and they had Holter monitors and all these new innovative technologies. They were like the cowboys of, you know, of care in terms of outside care, outside information. And here, having come into this field thinking I had all this tool set, including neurophysiology and an understanding of, you know, how the human body works, I didn't have access to it. So as I mentioned, you know, standard of care today is really not fantastic in neurology. We know that seizures occur outside of the hospital, very rarely, except in video monitoring settings, that when people are brought in, do we capture seizures in the hospital. Video EEG typically requires an inpatient admission, on average between 3 to 7 days. It's expensive, it's uncomfortable, and doesn't tell you what happened the other day at school when the child didn't learn anything, or what happened last night. We know that the gold standard, which is the kind of transfer of responsibility that doctors put onto their patients, is that we ask our families to hover, to watch their loved ones, to be able to report back to the neurologist if they're having seizures. And you can imagine that puts a tremendous amount of stress on families. And in the best case scenario, we know that 50% of seizures are missed, if not more. There are a couple of devices on the market that can measure the convulsive seizure type, but as I mentioned, that's the minority of seizures, leaving the bulk of seizures uncovered. So today, without data, as a clinician, I was guessing. I would ask my patients, how many seizures since the last visit? Is your child having any side effects? The mother or father would be exasperated with me and say, I don't know, my kid's cranky. I don't know if it's the medicines, they're at daycare. How do you expect me to tell you what's going on? Don't you already know, doctor? And what's the result of this? Well, it can lead to a significant diagnostic delay in just making the diagnosis of epilepsy during very critical years of development. It leads to a trial and error approach. So a patient might tell me, oh, I had 3 seizures since the last visit. And I go, well, Are you sure? Should we go up on the meds? And we're basically just trying, as my patients would say, doctor, you're just experimenting on me. But no, it's not experimenting. It's rational decision-making, but based on not so great information, right? And we know that in the United States, from the time of diagnosis until someone gets to an epilepsy center like CHOC, takes 18 years. So if someone's diagnosed in childhood, they may not be offered an interventional surgery until well in adulthood. And as pediatricians, you can understand how that could significantly impact people's lives. So I really started the company with the goal of stopping guessing and really start measuring what's happening to patients. And the fundamental insight that our technology is based on is that the network that controls eye movements is spread out throughout the brain, and that when you perturb that network through seizures or other neurological diseases, it's then measurable in the eye through analysis of passive eye movements. So we are building a personalized medicine technology that uses eye movements as the input for an algorithm that analyzes eye movements to identify seizures and side effects in order to provide the clinician with the valuable data that they need to make decisions about what to do next with the patient. And towards that goal, we have partnered with CHOC to run our clinical study. And this data actually that's sitting right here comes from a patient from CHOC. So in order to start the company, I had to do a proof of concept. I did this while I was at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital in Oakland. We did an IRB-based 30-patient observational study where we looked at children who were at risk for absence seizures and compared their eye movements to the EEG read of a very skilled neurologist. And we're able to show that when a child had a seizure, what the families described, which is this funny glazed over appearance of their eyes, was actually measurable through eye tracking. And that's what you see here in the upper left and right. We were able to show that the seizure, which is demarcated by the red line, that the eye actually stopped moving in both eyes, followed by a return to normal movement activity. So in order to get a device to market, we really had to go through many steps, and we're not there. We're on the journey right now, and Parth will go into some of the details. But we completed the proof of concept, as I mentioned. We did extensive market validation through actually the National Science Foundation I-Core program, and later the NIH I-Core program, which allowed us to do over 200 customer discovery interviews throughout the epilepsy ecosystem. We completed a pre-submission meeting with the FDA, and Nadine knows about our journey because we're in the Consortium for Technological Innovation in Pediatrics as well, and they have been a great resource for supporting us. Then we began our multi-center study. Our sites include CHOC, UCSD, UCSF, as well as Wake Forest. We are currently recruiting patients for that study. So if you know anyone with absence epilepsy that wants to participate, please send them to CHOC as the nearest site. The plan is once this study is complete, we'll refine our sensitivity and specificity. We'll be able to go back to the FDA with a new protocol for a validation study, which will be another multi-center study with the goal then of submitting to the FDA for FDA clearance to get the product to market. So I'm going to let Parth take over from here, and he will introduce himself.
And Rachel, thank you so much. We want to make sure that we leave about 5 minutes at least for Q&A at the end of the presentation. That would be great. I think we'll have a lot of questions.
Yeah, so we'll leave 5 minutes for Q&A. So hi everyone, my name is Parth, COO and co-founder at Eysz. Started off my career as a software engineer, worked some time in program management and in product management, but most of my life has been in alliances. I've spent about 20 years in the medical device industry, almost all of it in radiation oncology. Started off my career at Siemens Healthcare, which had 500,000 employees. And then I went to Varian Medical System, which had 6,500. And then eventually started my own consulting. And I was helping startups to scale and grow by leveraging alliances. And I had a real passion for working with startups that were doing social good through innovation. I started working with startups and I saw incremental innovation. And then I met Rachel back in December of 2018 in what I thought was going to be a 3-week consulting project. And as I started working more closely with her and learning about neurology, I grew disturbingly fascinated. I feel like neurology is where oncology was probably about 30 years ago when it comes to tools and data clinicians has, technology adoption, just even standard of treatment and care. And so after learning about her transformational solution, I decided to join her full time as a co-founder. So, for any medtech startup, you got your product strategy, your regulatory strategy, your reimbursement strategy, you've got to deal with investors, and you've got to figure out clinical adoption. The thing to remember is research impacts all of these, and all of these strategies drive your research. So it's really important to find the right research partner. And, a lot of people just focus on price, reputation, and patient volume. But, we took it one step further. We used those criteria to find partners, but we also looked at the people that the research institution was bringing, the process. Phuong talked about us being flexible. We felt CHOC had flexible processes compared to other research institutions. The other thing is the passion that the techs brought, the PI brought, was really inspiring for us. They shared the same passion for the technology as we did, which was a huge plus. And, to be honest, the elements we saw in CHOC became the ground for our selection criteria to evaluate other sites as we went along. And, one of the things that really stuck out, it was a really collaborative engagement. And we had a lot of ups and downs, but through those downs, we were able to overcome obstacles. Once we got the budgeting, the IRB approval, we were ready to go train. And then boom, we were told no visitors allowed at CHOC. And we weren't ready to do remote training. But the techs, the PIs, the study coordinators were really flexible, were working with us. We finally got them trained. And then we were ready for the first patient. Boom, we couldn't do the first patient because we never got to go see the site and then we realized the techs are sitting in a separate room 20 feet away from the patient, which is a configuration no other one of our sites had. The techs worked with us. We figured out a remote solution for them to use. We got it all developed, tested, and we were ready to go. And then IT came in. And so having worked with other IT departments at other hospitals in my prior life, those tend to be one-way conversations. You got to do it or you can't play ball at the hospital. We found the IT group to be very collaborative. They told us what they needed, why they needed. The PI was with us. The IT group from the neurology department was with us. And it was, again, really collaborative. We made it all the way through. Finally, we started treating patients, or not treating patients, but recruiting patients for the study. And then the state lockdown happened in California. And so we were struggling to meet our patient volume goals. But again, we were brainstorming constantly. We were collaborating, coming up with ideas. The PI would execute, the techs would execute, we would execute. And we're proud to say, I think CHOC is the highest performing site right now of all our study sites. So the takeaway message for us to y'all would be, with your research partners is always be collaborating. They have a ton of value that they can provide aside from just doing a study protocol. Be goal driven, share the goals with them so they know what they're working towards, and always be managing risks together. Treat your study project as a project, right? There's always risk to projects. How are you going to mitigate those risks? And your study partners may eventually be your customers. So start doing customer discovery, understand what are their challenges, how can you help improve their workflows, what are the biggest unmet needs at their institutions. And so I will end it with that as our big takeaway. So thank you all. We also are doing an equity crowdfund. So if you guys want to learn more about how you can invest in our startup, as with little as $500, there's the URL right there.
Great, thank you so much, appreciate it. So right now we'll open it for Q&A. I know some of you were typing into the chat box, but please feel free to unmute yourself and actually ask the question because some of you already got the answer potentially, so we don't want to go, everyone is chatting on the chat box. So please unmute and go ahead and ask your questions.
So hi, my name is Sana. And I had a question around how you identified the right PIs to work in the projects. So I find that to be the most difficult part is identifying, and maybe that's specific to my space also, because that's not, my space is not driven by doctors, but it's driven by nurses. And so it's hard to find the one person accountable as a PI who can then run the study, because I would need a doctor. And it's usually some work that falls on nurses. But how did you go about identifying the right PIs and then recruiting them on board? And did you work with any of them to do an SBIR, and what was the process for that? So, because they're the PI on the grant, but the grant goes through the facility.
So I can take that. So I think one of the really important things about understanding how your study is going to run is to do sufficient customer discovery around who your technology impacts and who would benefit the most from your technology. And as you do the customer discovery and understand the intricacies of how the institution works and how decision-making is done, you should be able to identify within a specific institution who the power players are in that space that are either on the committees or making the decisions regarding nursing. And typically, they would also be able to point you in that direction. So for example, you know, in my area, there's a specific list of institutions that are level 3 and level 4 epilepsy centers. And so within the list, I had the advantage, obviously, of understanding how these systems work, but you could start talking to people and understanding how the within an institution, everybody connects. In terms of an SBIR, there's a lot of resources out there to help you write SBIRs. It's not like a, hey, I'm going to go sit down and spend 2 weeks writing a grant. It is a, what somebody told me was you dedicate a month of your life to writing an SBIR, and it's completely true. And you typically need a tremendous amount of support. So we actually used a grant writing company that helped us submit our SBIRs, and I strongly recommend you go down that path. Depending on what your timelines are, they add a tremendous amount of value add.
And again, it's very beneficial for the investors to see that you actually have non-diluted funding. Any other questions? Or maybe Nadine or Phuong, if you have any comments on how to find PIs or whom to connect with.
I think flexibility is key. Dr. Cooperman didn't mention, but the neurologist that she first spoke with at CHOC turned out to be ultimately a co-I on the study and not the PI. We as a team evaluate the study opportunity and thought that another neurologist who had more bandwidth has the right training and the right amount of passion and interest with this technology would better serve as the PI. So that flexibility was really helpful, and she worked with us to allow us to do that, to change her original contact to be a co-investigator, not the lead investigator. You don't have to necessarily identify the PI when you approach an institution. You can start, as I've shared, with the clinical, if you're doing a clinical trial, with the clinical trial administrative group, and they can help you find the right party. It's a common part of my job to take study opportunities and quote unquote shop it with various qualified clinicians within CHOC and identify the party that's interested, the party that has the right training, and make that match. And sometimes I make the match with multiple people, and through conversation, people either select themselves to move forward, or they say, you know, this is very interesting, but I'm doing something that might be competitive with the study, so I'll step back. So start with the clinical trial unit at the institution that you want to work with. They can help as well.
Would you also advise to approach nursing innovation? Or
Depending on the project.
Yeah, or would you still go through you? I guess, would you still go through you first? So there's no multiple entry points. Would you still recommend going through you, or looking, or if maybe there's no one in other institutions like you specifically, right? Or they're not as willing to help.
No, that might not be. Yeah, that might not be the case. So a lot of pediatric hospitals might have a nursing research or nursing innovation and research arm, and they are your researchers. They don't necessarily have the business processes to support the engagement. So you would treat them as you do a clinician who you want to work with. So you can contact a nurse through the nursing innovation or nursing research arm of a pediatric hospital you're working with, but don't forget to be connected with a research administrator as well. That person's going to help you again with the contracting, with IRB approval, with budgeting, et cetera, that the clinical contact might not be able to help execute.
I think another thing to add, Phuong, that you brought up in terms of picking the right co-PI and sort of growing together is that a lot of the PIs want to publish. They want to share in the success with the entrepreneur, with the innovator as well. And so if you create those kind of moments where you can claim success together, I think that becomes really attractive to folks as well.
Yeah, and Dr. Cooperman spoke about that, right? We're equally passionate about this. We recognize that there's a need for the technology that her company's bringing to bear, and so we're interested in it in its availability so that we can use it and create impact for our patient. And when you have that kind of shared commitment, we're very invested in her company's success because we want to see this translate to patient care. And so we look for partners like that, right? CHOC is a mission-driven organization. Servicing our patient, creating impact for our patients is what we're about. And so if we can line up with a company to deliver that, that's the sweet spot for us.